is to talk about the larger context of a number of these issues. And I want to say some things specifically about the nature of monuments and the nature of statues and memorials, and then some other things about a group of international cases that has a fair amount of resonance with what's going on in the United States. So, let's see. I'm going to skip over a few things. One of, there's this notion of should we retain these or get rid of them, that kind of thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about moving them to sculpture parks, which I think is really interesting. But I think your presentations are going to go through the options much more systematically than mine, so I'm just going to leave that in your skillful hands. I would like to emphasize the way in which our response to some monuments, at least the ones that matter, is deeply emotional, deeply affective. All you have to do is go to the Vietnam Memorial wall in D.C. and you just see that. I mean, it's just the emotion is just right there, almost all the time. There are a lot of things that we don't respond in that emotional way about, but that's usually not the sculpture that changes our lives. So I think it's more interesting to concentrate on some of these things here. First of all, I just want to say that toppling statues is a long tradition, going back many, many centuries. I'm going to just talk about a few here. This is actually a scene in Lower Manhattan in an area called Bowling Green when they were tearing down the statue of George III, and with typical, which was largely a lead statue, with typical American industriousness, converted it into over 42,000 musket balls. But they did save a few things like the head and hands, and that got traded around later. But the toppling of Saddam, which was largely done by American Marines, but staged in a way that, a lot of the photographs showed more of the Iraqis out in the street. The toppling of a Confederate soldier in Durham, and I want to come back to this because I want to talk about the difference between the respect we often have for soldiers versus their political and military leaders. And I think that's a distinction that runs pretty deep and through a number of cultures. The sculpture of Cecil Rhodes at the University of Cape Town, the Rhodes Scholar and all that kind of thing. And they're seriously considering taking the one in Oxford down as well. So, we'll see how that works out. In Yonkers, they've sort of decapitated Columbus, but it was not a very big statue. But currently, Mayor de Blasio is discussing what should be done about the Columbus in Columbus Square, which is a big thing. And so, and Mayor de Blasio is also Italian. So, it's going to be very interesting to see what they're doing is trying to find other alternatives besides retain or remove. What middle ground? And I think that's some of the middle ground that you guys are going to be sketching out here. That I just like that picture. This is Columbus falling to the ground in Caracas. So all over the world, you find we're pulling down statues, and we always have been. So the United States, in facing this problem, is not unique. And we ought not to think there's something either wrong with us or something highly privileged about us that we're able to engage in this discussion. What I'm going to do in terms of my remarks is first give a bunch of preliminary observations that may well take us to the end of our time, and talk about, in particular, the ethical considerations, there's a certain kind of temporality associated with statues that's worth noting here, you know, because what they do is they bring the past into the present first. And on the basis of that, then we plot our course toward the future. You know? So statues, even though they look like they just sit or stand there, you know, they're really part of a very dynamic life, and it's helpful to realize that kind of temporality. There's also another aspect about statues in contrast to lots of other kinds of ways of memorializing things. They can live on, and I think Gail Collins was originally said this, you know, they can live on well past their shelf life. You know, they're still there when you get tired of them, or when you find them offensive. You know, in contrast, I mean, think about what happens to pieces of music. You know, you can just sort of avoid playing them. You know, or paintings. At least on some days, you can sneak them into the back room from a museum, and they're just not on display then. Songs, you know, can just no longer be sung, or, I mean, think about, if any of you've studied the Aeneid, which was one way of memorializing, you know, the Aeneas and the warrior. And, you know, it begins with, I sing of arms and the man, armor verum quod you know, but if you tire of that, you don't have to get rid of 20 tons of stone, you know, you just sort of stop repeating it. That becomes, by the way, particularly interesting and relevant in cultures that are nomadic, in cultures that are less technological than ours. Often their ways of passing traditions down and memorializing things are more fluid than you would find in our type of culture. And finally, the type of sculptures that are most difficult are those that are carved into the sides of mountains. And I actually have a few examples of that, because what do you do? You know, and again, you know, this is not just American. You know, think about the attack on the Buddhas in Afghanistan and the destruction of them. We see this is a continuing, and I must say, I've never been to Mount Rushmore, you know, and these days I sort of feel like it wouldn't hurt to go soon before someone blows it up, you know? You know, and I don't mean that, it could very well be someone I know, so it's not, I don't mean that necessarily in saying that well, I won't say more about who I know. I want to mention in these situations, there is a widespread belief, at least in the West, that we want to distinguish between the rank and file military, you know, the people who fight on the front lines, and those who are in charge, those who sent them in the first place, okay? And, you know, and that's one of those earlier pictures I showed you of the pulling down of the Confederate soldier. You know, that, to me, that's in a somewhat different category than pulling down a statue of Lee or something like that, you know? And, you know, we may well want to talk about that. You may well have different feelings about it. I'll say a little bit about the names of the dead and come back to this, but some of the most powerful sculpture memorials are the ones that name everyone who's fallen. You know, and you think about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. You know, that was not. You know, that was about those people. You know, and you think about. Have anyone been to the 9/11 Memorial? Yeah, good. You know, one of the things you saw is that the names of all the people who died there are up on all the way around the two pits. You know, I think it's a tremendously powerful monument. And naming is a crucial thing in many ways. Once, a number of years ago, I had H.R. McMaster here to give some talks on a Stockdale lecture, and he gave a guest lecture in my class. And it was very interesting to me. I mean, I never grew up with military. You know, my dad was a cop. Almost all the adults I knew were either cops or worked for the water department in Chicago. You know, I was a small Irish circle, but when McMaster talked about various battles that he'd been in, he'd always mention the names of the men who were serving under him and their rank, and you know, and that's a real military thing. You know, that's one of the ways in which you show respect. If any of you remember the movie Saving Private Ryan, you know, which was a fine movie, and there's one point where they finally found Ryan, who doesn't want to go home, and one of the guys in the squad said, "Hey, asshole, you know, we lost 3 times trying to get you. You need to come with us." And Ryan asked, "Who were they?" And he didn't quite hear one of the names, and so he asked again, "What was his name?" You know, people don't die anonymously. And that's one of these really fundamental moral intuitions that, you know, you think about the disappeared in Latin American countries and the fight to get their names recognized again, you know. I want to say a couple things about memory and memorials, because, you know, about what it means to get something right. I've got if anyone wants, I can send you the copy of the PowerPoint, which has footnotes in the notes section. But John Dean, who's one of the people who testified back when Richard Nixon was being impeached, and he was a really powerful presence in testifying before Congress. But and he thought he knows everything, you know. And then later, people went back and checked it, and they found often he was wrong about particular details, but he was always right about what happened, about the story. You know, it might have been a day earlier, a day later, you know, that type of thing. And so what we want in memorials is to get it right somehow, whatever that takes. Let me give you 3 global examples. One, this is interesting to me because it's something, this is a memorial. This one was just opened in San Francisco like a week ago or so, okay? To the comfort women, that is the South Korean and other women that the Japanese had basically enslaved as sex slaves for their army. And there's been quite a bit of opposition to any kind of memorial to these people, you know, and part of it is that they have faced one of their memorials is right opposite the Japanese embassy in South Korea. These are just some of the statues, and there's one picture of the reality, and you see the stunning difference here. Okay, this is a statue. I've never seen this in statue stuff before. They put these on buses in South Korea, and they're statues of comfort women, and to remind people, even when they're on the bus, that this happened, and this happened here. Okay, and there's some good things about that. I want to talk for probably 1 minute about France and 1 minute about Germany. The reaction of the French to what they did during World War II, where there's a tremendous amount of collaboration. And one of the, you know, they deported 200,000 Jews and others for the Nazis. And the French did it, you know, it was their their police, they put them on their buses and all that kind of thing. One of the most now famous, though not at the time at all, was a roundup of French Jews who were taken to the Veldiv, which is basically a, what do you call the bicycle?
Velodrome.
Velodrome, thank you. It was a velodrome. It was sort of their equivalent of the New Orleans amphitheater in terms of the conditions. They designed a powerful monument about that 70 years later. So they didn't exactly rush into the job. If you've seen that movie, Sarah's Key, that's a central part of that movie. And most French people under 35 have never heard of this, you know, and I would take my students there. When I first took them there was almost nothing. And now, just in the last year, Macron, the new president, has admitted French complicity. You know, he stopped saying the standard line was, well, bad things happen here, you know, and he changed the active voice. We did terrible things to these people, you know, and that's an assumption of responsibility that took a long time. This is the French monument to those who were deported. It's down almost underneath Notre Dame, you know, at the edge of the island. And it's, I'm not sure if the word Jew is anywhere in the monument, you know, nor the names of any of the people. And, you know, the Germans kept names all the time, so they would have been largely available. There's a nice quote from Sartre, that the choice that each of you make in your life is authentic because it was made in the presence of death. Well, BFD, you know, what's really at stake here is what did the French people do in carrying this out? And that Sartre quote says nothing about this, you know? So it's a, and this, for the first 50 years, was all that they had up there. One tiny plaque. This is a detail from the new one that got dedicated in 2005. Germany figured out some of the ways of getting, you know, one of the odd things about the Confederate controversy is how is it that the losers got to choose all this stuff, you know? And there are some good books about what that was involved in. The Germans were more, you know, had their face in it, and they established denazification panels that got rid of 3.5 million Nazis from government positions. That still left a lot still there, but you know, it was a step. All Nazi books and periodicals were eliminated from libraries. They outlawed the display of Nazi swastikas. I mean, it's easier to be a Nazi in the United States than it is in Germany, you know, by far. They buried executed Nazis en masse in unmarked graves, so no one can make a shrine of the grave. And then German novelists such as Heinrich Böll and Günter Grass and the like really managed to bring this to consciousness as well. I remember Heinrich Böll got the Nobel Prize for Literature. I think it was maybe in the 70s, but he'd been writing for a long time. And the prize commendation read in part for his just unwavering work in cleaning the German language from all this stuff that the Nazis had made it mean, you know. And there's one of the things that's very close to my heart is that Willy Brandt, who was then prime minister of what was West Germany in effect, went to Warsaw where the eternal flame, to Holocaust victims there, burned. And what he did, and this was totally unscripted, you know, is he knelt before the eternal flame. Now, technically, he's not head of state. In Germany, there's a president who does the ceremonial head of state stuff, but he's head of government, you know? And to have, just imagine what it would be like for a head of government to kneel before a monument that highlights your own guilt. And I'll come back to this in 1 second. But there's a picture of Brandt. And Brandt was a tough guy, you know. I never met him, but I had friends who used to be with him regularly, that usually involved a fair amount of alcohol. But, you know, he was a resistance fighter. Willy Brandt is his nom de guerre from the Second World War. You know, he faced adversity, and he passed the test, whatever test you want. And when he knelt there, you know, I've been living there for maybe 6 months or so, it electrified the country. You know, it was, and many people were angry. Others, particularly younger people that I knew, I remember one guy saying, you know, this is the first time I can be proud I'm German. And this is the depth, the power of monuments, you know, in defining who we are. And part of that definitional process is how those who lead us react to these monuments. You know, and then this is an earlier monument, and again, it's about the theme of this individual soldier. This was an old guardhouse in the 1850s, and it had been through multiple iterations. That hole in the ceiling is what they call the oculus, and it's completely open to the weather. So if it's raining, it comes down, if it's snowing, whatever, you know. And it has only one thing in it, basically, and that's this statue by Kata Kolovitz on Mother with her dead son, a soldier. You know, and everyone who walks in, it's the quietest place in Berlin. You know, you don't have to have any signs or anything. Let me conclude this portion by just saying about a monument that doesn't exist, because part of what's important are the monuments we have, but also the monuments we don't have. You know, and I know many Americans are puzzled about how we have this controversy about North Korea and the like, and almost very few have any idea what we did to them. You know, I mean, basically, we carpet bombed them for 2 straight years, and when we ran out of cities, we turned to infrastructure, and we destroyed dams and roads and things like that. And I've given a few quotes about, you know, what's involved in that. Imagine if there were a monument where both sides could meet. You know, no easy solutions or anything like that, but maybe just to be in the presence of one another's loss, and to mourn what that cost us and what it cost them. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks for your patience.
So we are trying for both of us something that's new, writing a paper together, right? So this is a bit like a dialogue. Sometimes it becomes a bit like role-playing. So there was actually a choice about reading the quote of the Blue Ribbon Commission, this really energetic and progressive commission of activists from city of Charlottesville in Virginia, and then there was the role of reading President Trump's quote. We had a draw and I lost. So I'll be your President Trump for today, I guess, for a brief while. But here it is. I mean, you should know that this is a joint presentation and something really, really new and exciting for both of us. So let us start by asking the question, how do you represent with a monument or a counter monument a historical truth as traumatic and shameful as slavery. We are both architects, and our own disciplines, be it architecture, art, or historic preservation, are often geared toward producing or conserving an aesthetic heritage. But producing aesthetic monuments to represent this history may be insensitive to the unspeakable violence that took place. Willfully forgetting the legacy of slavery is problematic, but finding a way to remember it is difficult as well. So all these questions have been haunting us since August. But before we focus on what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, we should remind you that the legacy of slavery is not only a problem of American South. The issue is not limited to the fate of the Confederate monuments either. The question of historical justice and reparations are being asked in many campuses around the United States. Think about the revelations. Was it Georgetown, right? I think nation's oldest Jesuit Catholic university profited from the sale of slaves in the 19th century. Here in the American South, we haven't fully come to terms with the violent legacy of colonialism, the dispossession, enslavement, and near genocide inflicted upon the indigenous peoples. We celebrate the mission-style Spanish colonial architecture as a heritage we are proud of, but that very architectural heritage, as beautiful as it is, may be glossing over an inconvenient truth about the colonial experience. And we are meeting, of course, in the Sarah Hall, so think about that as well. All this is to say that this question about memory and monuments is not someone else's problem in a distant southern town. Right, I want to emphasize that. It's really our problem.
So, I know the next slide.
Next slide. Oh, not that. This.
This one.
Yes, too many equipment. Yes.
So, few small towns feature as many architectural heritage sites as Charlottesville, Virginia. Here you see a map with the University of Virginia campus that was founded and designed by Thomas Jefferson with this famous neoclassical architecture. 3 miles east of downtown is Jefferson's Villa, Monticello, restored in the early 20th century. Next. In the first decades of the 20th century, Charlottesville's town center was remodeled after American City Beautiful movement. A carefully orchestrated public arts program financed by the philanthropist Paul Goodloe McIntyre included the equestrian statues of Robert E. Lee in the Lee Park and that of Thomas Stonewall Jackson in Jackson Park. Both statues reinforced the lost cause interpretation of the Confederacy, which represented the Civil War as a heroic fight to preserve the Southern heritage, freedom, and the state's right to secede. They make no mention of slavery. Recently, the City Council of Charlottesville voted to remove Robert Lee's statue and rename the Lee Park as Emancipation Park. Likewise, the Jackson Park was renamed Justice Park. Vinegar Hill on the map, which is there, you can see it, is the location of an African-American neighborhood that was raised in the 1960s during the city's urban renewal and gentrification. On August 12th, 2017, various far-right groups protesting the planned removal of the Robert E. Lee statue marched in Charlottesville. The Unite the Right rally included white supremacists, white nationalists, white neo-Nazis, and neo-Confederates. Some of the protesters carried guns, semi-automatic rifles, Nazi swastikas, Confederate battle flags, racist and anti-Semitic, and also anti-Muslim banners. Violent clashes erupted between the marchers and the anti-fascist counter-demonstrators. A man allegedly affiliated with the white supremacists drove a car into a crowd of counter-demonstrators, killing Heather Heyer, a 32-year-old paralegal from Charlottesville, and injuring many others.
Yeah. In a combative press conference 3 days after the event, President Trump contended the following: all of those people, excuse me, I condemned neo-Nazis. I condemned many groups. But not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch. Those people were also there because they wanted to protest taking down a statue, Robert E. Lee. So, excuse me, and you take a look at some of the groups and you see, and you would know if you were honest reporters, which in many cases you are not, but many of those people were there to protest the taking down of the statue, Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson is coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next? And is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop? You actually also read this. So, end of quote. Okay. It is the moral equivalency that the president seems to be making between the white supremacists and the counter-demonstrators that shock most commentators. Not long ago, the Obama coalition, you'll remember, promised us a post-racial future that hasn't materialized. President Trump was swept into power by turning to memory. Instead of a future that unites us, we are now obsessed with a past that divides us. Here, Mr. Trump is expressing a view that is shared by many, that the white American heritage is under attack by a group of post-colonialist, pro-reparations, Black Lives Matter revisionists. He contends that the problem was caused in Charlottesville by the political activism and the historical revisionism of the city council. Had the city council not voted to remove the Confederate monuments from the town's prominent places, there would be no problem. For Charlottesville was one charming, beautiful town, graced with the great heritage of our founding fathers.
The city council created the Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Memorials and Public Spaces, composed of local residents and activists. Their charge was to make recommendations to the city council about how public spaces may tell a better and more complete story of the city of Charlottesville. So in that report, the commission contended that far too often African American history has been either ignored, silenced, or suppressed. Also, far too often our public spaces and histories have also ignored, silenced, or suppressed the story of white supremacy. They also state that the narratives that support white supremacy that began as long as 1619 in Virginia, although challenged by many, continue in various forms today. They contend the impacts of those narratives today are evidenced around us in the loss of African American population and the racial disparities. To tell a more complete racial history, it is necessary for us, this is the Blue Ribbon Commission saying, to use our public spaces to promote understanding of our history, good and bad. So the commission wanted to reveal the truth of history by redesigning public spaces and public memory. So their question was how to break the racist transmission. And in that, working with local historians, city planners, and students, both from University of Virginia and the community, the commission deliberated on a number of choices about the Confederate monuments, the Lee and Jackson statues. They face actually 4 options. We'll talk about these options that they faced, but we actually want to know from you all what the best strategy would be in your opinion. So the very first option would be to leave it alone. Many would say that this is wrong, but some would say this is right. Why? Because it's a beautiful statue. The second option would be balance change, would be to basically that. Here, the city officials are attempting to balance the overall tone of the movement, leaving an existing Confederate monuments and adding another monument which represents African American history. So this model has been tested in Richmond, Virginia with the Arthur Ashe Monument. And this monument actually sits around a few other Confederate monuments. So one may perceive this to be an act of calming the movement, maybe. The new monument acts as a way to appease both sides. So the balancing change attempts to connect the difficult history to the contemporary issues of equity. Since oftentimes African American history has been either ignored or suppressed or both, the balancing gives a sort of voice as a means to offering a more complete story, maybe. So the Blue Commission of Charlottesville rejected this option, arguing, and I quote, "These type of correctives create a superficial understanding of both history and problems in the present, or the false sense that these problems have been resolved and do not necessitate further actions." End quote.
Okay, so we talked about the first option and the second option. And the third option is maybe one that comes to mind quite fast. Just remove it, right? Remove and erase the heritage of the so-called lost cause and then what initially the commission wanted to do, or the city council, is to take the Lee statue and then remove it from its location in downtown and then take it to a faraway park, McIntyre Park. But then, of course, there is a paradox there, because if the whole idea was really to educate the people about the history of white supremacy, to erase it and then act as if nothing really happened would not necessarily be fulfilling the wishes of the city council. Fourth option, maybe the most interesting and perhaps the most philosophically compelling, would be what they called transform in place. The idea is to leave the Confederate statues in place, but intervene in them to transform the meaning they communicate to the public. This could perhaps be achieved by either the change in the context, their context in the park, so that the statue is seen less as a monument, or by adding critical signs basically on it that highlights the shame and violence of white supremacy. So trying to actually take a monument that's seen as aesthetic and then try to turn it into something didactic. Okay. So Aarynn here has been trying to prevent me from talking about Germany too much, because we have already Professor Hinman, of course, who is an expert. But those of you who are familiar with the counter monuments, and those erected in sites of Nazi violence or the Holocaust in Europe, will know that this kind of intervention, meaning this transform in place intervention, may lead to two very different results. The first is to reject aesthetics altogether. I mean, you maybe heard about often the philosopher Theodor Adorno quoted, "No more poetry after Holocaust." No more poetry. I mean, it is so traumatic that we should not be acting to represent it with aesthetic means like architecture or monuments or sculpture. Because according to this view, basically aestheticizing history or politics, the new monument trivializes trauma and can even be seen to be disrespectful to the victims. Or actually it can have a different effect. The city can choose to create an aesthetic object that apologizes for the violence and inequality. Let's call this an apologetic monument. The members of the Blue Ribbon Commission were torn between option 3 and 4, between just remove it versus transform in place. Yeah.
The city strategy went above and beyond the fate of the Confederate monuments. It included creating a new public memory to tell the full truth about history. That included the display of the slave auction block by the courthouse in the newly renamed Justice Square. Vinegar Hill, another initiative. Another initiative that was the creation of the Vinegar Hill Park and Monument, a historic neighborhood formerly inhabited, like I said, by African Americans, was raised in the 1960s in the name of urban renewal, which in turn caused most African Americans to leave. The Blue Ribbon Commission has furnished a set of plans here that includes the creation of new signage and a new monument by artist Melvin Edwards. And so in discussing these strategies, we're curious to know what you think about the viability and the strategies of redesigning public memory.
Yeah, so we will conclude by questioning whether the city of Charlottesville and the state of Virginia, who are, by the way, on the opposite sides of this issue, are misguided to think that they can control public memory or reform a historical narrative by redesigning monuments and public spaces. The need to seek justice in public memory of a city is real and important, and it should be up to the local community and the city's voters to decide what to do with the Confederate statues in their town. But a summer of violent protest and counter-protest has also shown that social media create a new monumentality and preserve memory in a new iconic form. Imagine how disorienting it is for the residents of a bucolic university town to find suddenly out-of-town neo-Nazis organizing vigils and protests in your public spaces. Suddenly your public square became their site of pilgrimage. Memory has become performative, and the city governments are often helpless to control it. Likewise, performance as reproduced in iconic images have become far more effective in mobilizing public memory than traditional monuments. This does not mean, however, that the public art and public spaces are less important in the age of new media. Quite on the contrary, I think now the public spaces have a new global audience. That's it. So we are really very eager to hear you.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe we go back to. That's a good slide. You can leave it this.
Okay.
But there's also all this stuff. So choose between the two.
Yeah.
So
That's something between 3 and 4, that's
yeah.
an interesting option where you see this in Lithuania, in a number of other Eastern European countries where they've started these sculpture parks, and they bring those sculptures in. One of the rules is nothing stays on its pedestal.
Huh.
So, you see these things that used to tower above you, and now they're sort of, if not quite eye to eye, they're close to it. Toppled or broken statues go there, but kids can run around, play with them, and then you start adding context and all of this. And I could imagine, I have zero artistic ability, okay? But I could imagine doing white wire form sculptures of the things that had been omitted.
I see. Like traces of memory.
Right.
Professor Bobka had it.
Well, I think part of the controversy went in that these like the statue of Robert E. Lee, wasn't that constructed during the Jim Crow South? That
Yes.
wasn't
Yes.
constructed during the time of the
Right.
Confederacy in the sense that we're memorializing our hero. They were memorializing a time that they wanted to build up this image and mythology of of a very difficult time. And so I think that sort of bears repeating, just that sense that why were these statues erected, and recalling that history, I think, is an important part. 'Cause I think a lot of people who walk by them don't even know that until this all happened.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, they more than what they represent, they say something about the time when they were erected, which is often 1924, right? So yes, it tells a lot about Jim Crow
I had a
laws.
question, Professor. So you're saying during the time they erected it was kind of supporting racism in there? I mean, it was a sign of to
Yeah, these
represent
weren't
their-
necessarily erected during the Confederacy. They
Right.
were erected during a time when they were trying to promote segregation
Right.
and other.
So that's an interesting point. My name is Captain Ed Kaiser. I'm a professor I'm at the ROTC program. I teach ethics and leadership. We have the ROTC program. My cousin, who I'm visiting this week in Dallas, is a Dallas City Council member, and I'm not sure if you're aware of the controversy there, but they voted 13-1 after the Charlottesville incident to remove a statue of Robert E. Lee, and we were talking about it yesterday, and he said the same exact thing. That was erected in 1936, in a time when there was some similar things going on. It was a symbol of, racism. I mean, it was a way of saying. I think he was saying there was some legislation being passed or some desegregation rules or things going on, and that was a way of saying like it represented racist views, and that's why it was erected, and it was the exact same thing. And they voted to take it down because it was offensive. So it's just interesting. It was almost the same context of when it was erected.
Right. In fact, I think that there's a certain percentage that they can take. That and Dr. Hinman pointed out that when a monument shows the dead, the names of the dead, and I know that there are some of the monuments in the South that are devoted to those who died in the conflict. And that's a different kettle of
Right.
fish because that was usually done during the time.
Right, and often
That they
small
died.
town
Yeah.
monuments.
I see a hand.
So I thought that too, but I did look up, over 75% of Confederate monuments were built before Jim Crow civil rights era. So but it does raise the question, I think maybe a bit more broadly, of audience and intention. And so is the monument about memory for a particular person or a particular audience, or is it about an assertion of a particular statement or ideology to a different audience? And I think that's opens up a possibility about what to do with these monuments or how to handle new monuments.
Very quickly, audiences change.
Right.
Yes.
And that's so important
time,
to mention.
Right.
So I'm only going to say that in addition to audience, site. So right after I finished college, I surveyed all of the monuments and sculptures outdoors in a 3-county area around Austin. So I did all the Confederate ones
Oh, wow.
myself. And there were 3 on the Capitol grounds. And they're not civil rights era. That's actually not one of those. Shannon's right. Almost all of them are earlier, but they tend to be post-Reconstruction. So they're like 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910, and then a smattering in the 20s and 30s. So there is a disjuncture there. It is often about either the people who fought are dying, so we better do this now, or it is about reasserting, we're not going to reconstruct. But there was one in the cemetery that was actually Albert Sidney Johnson. And it was very different to survey the one, and I'm from New York, so I grew up with very few of these, or that was like Grand Army Plaza, right, in Brooklyn. But the one that was in the cemetery felt very different to me, and the audience felt different, and the purpose felt different than a total of 3 alone on a state capitol grounds, all erected around 1900. So I think this space, that's a seat of government. The Texas State Cemetery, all you have to do to get buried there is be either a veteran, a former senator, it's a classification. And in there, Barbara Jordan is right next to John Connolly, which is kind of nice.
I'm actually very glad Professor Hinman touched on this idea of the pedestal, because it's a really important notion, and it kind of touches on what I wanted to ask about, which is get you to reflect a little bit about the differences between monuments and memorials, because we seem to use it in terms of interchangeable.
Yes.
And I don't think they should be.
Great.
And somehow the pedestal kind of addresses maybe some of the differences in terms of intentions and perception or reception of the people.
Do you want to?
That's a philosophical question.
Well, I mean, I think,
It's very architectural.
Okay, architectural
yeah,
question.
memorials are really backward looking. Not in the bad sense, but, you know, they're remembering those whom we have lost, first and foremost, you know, and monuments have a certain kind of forward dimension about where we're going to go following this courageous leader that is no more.
Do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think I kind of grappled with that question myself as we were going back and forth through this presentation. And I don't know, with the, maybe we should have defined the term monument and then defined the term memorial to make it like absolutely crystal clear. But I don't know, I think monument is, it's more of to maybe give the public a sense of place, maybe, and maybe, you know, that was monument, and then memorial is maybe to allow the public to maybe grieve. So they're two separate sort of things. And so like with these monuments, I think they're absolutely recognized as public spaces. And so we might, you know, I think that's why there's all of this controversy coming around, regardless of when they were erected or the time period they were built. There's controversy with the space that they are taking up. And these are, you know, people from, you know, both sides of the coin. So.
Now, has anyone, you know, it occurred to me that people could just buy up a plot of land near the center of the town and say, all right, I'll buy the statue from you. You know, but people could still walk by and see it.
I think that's the, yeah.
You know, and I don't know if that's happened or not.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to avoid your question. Let me try to take a shot. So, I would say that, I mean, memorials are intentional objects, and monuments can be intentional, but oftentimes there is a category called unintentional monuments. I mean, in literature, there's literature about that. In the sense that something that has remained from an earlier era can change its meaning, but still preserve some of its monumentality and aesthetic qualities. Right? I mean, when you call something a monument, you already, I think, come to terms with the passage of time, that the initial intentions might change. I mean, it's very clear in the case of this monument, Robert E. Lee, because I imagine, I mean, it was in the Jim Crow era, right? And therefore, I mean, some people with graphics, they have shown that there is a spike in this kind of building whenever some communities, especially white communities, felt themselves kind of threatened or tried to actually establish some sort of authority. But basically, we've seen in this particular case that the initial purpose seemed to be establishing the lost cause, which is a very peculiar interpretation of history that we fought for Southern heritage, Southern way of life. And then, therefore, the Europeanness of this act of representation, which is a very like king statue sort of, somehow spoke to the fact that there is some sort of a grand taste with wineries and basically art collections. So there is a colonial European heritage that is also part of this. right? And fast forward when in 2017, when neo-Nazis show up in town, and you have definitely a different kind of audience, and the monument is there, but its interpretation has changed. Is that making sense? I mean, I think when you talk about monuments, you have to always take into consideration that the audiences and the meaning of the object will change as it goes through.
But just in terms of intention, if I may, I think if I can maybe break it down into a fairly simple
Yeah.
clarification, I would say the intentions of monuments is to heroicize.
Right.
That pedestal, that putting up that, look at us, this is
Sure.
a grand moment, a grand person, this is the history we somehow want to thrive to reconstruct, right? While memorials give us a space to reflect. And they're two very different things. One is sort of like moving us in a very powerful way
I got
towards
you,
a
yeah.
specific vision, while the other is giving us room to kind of be, you know. So if you look, for example, I grew up in Brooklyn too, and that Brooklyn Grand Army Plaza Memorial, which as a kid I used to walk around over and over because it was amazing, you know. That was a heroic thing. It was like a past that I never knew, but it was a past that was grand, right? But when I went to the Vietnam Memorial for the first time, and I kind of walked down that hill into that thing, that was a very transformative moment in
Yeah.
a very different way. While one said, you know, said, this is the ideal, the other said,
Yeah.
think about what occurred. And so this notion of heroicizing and reflecting, maybe it's too simple a way of breaking it down, but I think we should, in this debate about the cause, we have to look at intention.
Right.
This cause of like monuments and how they shape, offend, and attract debate. We have to look at the intentions.
And just following up on your way of dividing them, John, you know, you think about the volume around memorials versus monuments, and, you know, memorials are places where you become quiet, you know, and you remember, perhaps you grieve. Monuments are places where you compare with the person next to you about what and the volume level goes up.
Yes, sir.
President Obama said these monuments belong in a museum, and I believe he's right. We need a national museum to slavery.
Yeah.
And all, and everything it encompassed. None of this stuff should be in the public square. It's just plain evil. And that's what it represents. But it's something that this country should not forget. And again, I think a national museum is where every one of them should be. I wouldn't tear them down. I'd put them in a museum so that it's a remembrance of what happened here. Wasn't good.
Think you had a question?
I think it really doesn't matter whether you call them memorials or monuments. What I see in all of this is the thread of public rage. Not the entire community, but partial. Somebody gets angry. And when somebody gets angry, they're irrational and they do such things here. And that seems to be, to me, part of the equation in all of them. The tumbling of Columbus in Caracas, Hussein, what's going on now. People, individually, people have their own motives. But when there's public anger, as Emil Durkheim says, the collective conscience, it can get out of hand. And that's what's been happening.
So we would love to hear from our students. See, we've run out of good ideas. Questions? Yes?
Well, I don't know, but I was thinking about how in San Diego, they decided to take off the plaque that was right next to Martin Plaza, that's at the name of the Confederate, I don't know exactly who, but it was creating controversy. And I never saw much protest from people or anything, so a lot of it has to do with where you're at.
Yeah.
That creates that, like, change, because San Diego is meant to be like a very diverse community, very welcoming community. And so night where things happen, like that's what creates the problem. So, I don't know, for me, moving the monuments or to somewhere else would be better than just keeping them there, because then that creates.
That's an excellent idea. So you think that moving would be better than keeping it, even if you are transforming it? Is it better to move it to a museum, as you were saying? So it's better than, yeah.
I think transforming it in places, especially like, you know, all these different areas in the South where we have these monuments, I think that would just create like a lot more tension between the various groups, because, I mean, if you're upset about a Confederate monument, like, you're obviously frustrating one group, but if you put up something just to try and balance it, it's not gonna like, it like completely dissolve all the problems that you're gonna have in the other group. It gets like even more frustrated, so I think that like moving them to a museum would be the best result.
Yeah, I sort of agree with that, if you were to, I forget like what stage you called it, but if you were to like have the one statue and then erect another one that sort of contrasts it, you're
Right.
sort of pitting two groups of people against each other, in a sense, like trying to balance it. I think like some people might interpret it as like creating a conflict. So
Right.
I say maybe moving the statues also.
Mario, that's a great great comment. But asking to many of you, before that, yeah, go ahead.
So my personal opinion is that sometimes it's not, well, maybe a lot of it does have to do with monuments, right? But more how people perceive them, because with or without the monuments, racism will exist. So it's primarily
Right.
the problem isn't within the monuments.
Right. I just want to, I don't know, extend that comment because, I don't know, my thoughts through the whole thing, at first I was leaning a bit towards maybe option 3 or option 2, like balancing the change. But I think if the conversation is not happening and issues cannot be really resolved, I mean, I think that's a problem in America, though, really around the world, but the conversation is not being had. And that's a problem. Like you're saying, the racism will still exist without the monuments. Okay.
On the idea of transformation, the problem I would have with that is the idea that it seems to be almost brushing the underlying notions under the rug. It's kind of covering up the problem without fully acknowledging like the underlying idea of racism and the things that, what was the context in which this statue was made. So it's trying to rewrite it without, I think, fully bringing attention to what it originally meant. So I think it doesn't really cover it.
So this example in Richmond, no one seems to be satisfied with it. Look, it's free speech. If you are celebrating the history of Confederacy, you may still just, as they are actually yearly events, people gathering and parading against Confederate monuments of Richmond in Monument Avenue, right? Let those people be and express themselves as they wish, whereas we will go and pay our respect to African American heritage of action. No one is satisfied with this idea? I'm really curious.
Comment?
Yes.
That's something I actually would support, although I find it to be in the minority opinion for some reason.
Right.
Because the issue that I have, and chiefly with removing the monuments from their current places or centralizing them into certain museums, is that you are either removing or limiting the opportunity for conversation. These are prompts where, especially if you place mirror images of someplace society is moving to or something else to aspire towards, that contrast, I think, is an opportunity for dialogue, which the dialogue is what is going to address the issues in this country, because that are located in people, not in these statues themselves. And so if you try to remove or limit the conversation, you're just going to prolong the problem. People aren't going to talk, they aren't going to discuss, there can't be dissemination of ideas, and people will become more entrenched and more polarized in the ideas they already have.
Yes.
So the problem I have with that though is that you're validating both sides equally. So you're saying that the values of the past, which were intrinsically super racist, are equal to what we're aiming to change towards. And you might be saying that, yeah, it's aiming towards a conversation, but it's a conversation in which both sides, racism and like the history of genocide in America, for example, is seen as equal as the future that we're trying to build towards. A future where people aren't killed because of their skin color. So I feel like, though the idea of having a dialogue there by having both sides is a valuable one, I feel that we're not really in the situation right now as a country, especially because of how polarized everything is getting, where that conversation can be had safely for both groups.
I think one important point is, I think a lot of people that are for the monuments don't see it as a racist, they don't see themselves as being racist. I mean, there's a group of racists out there, there's a large group out there that don't see themselves as racist. They look at it as a different symbol to them. So I think it's, to address the issue fairly, you have to look at it from both sides and put yourselves in their shoes, because there's a lot of people out there that don't consider themselves racist and don't feel they have those racist views. They think this is a symbol of, you know,
heritage and
recognizing, you know, the brave soul, whatever it is, but they don't see it as a symbol of slavery. And I'm not, that's not my personal opinion, but.
Thank you. Yeah,
No, what I forgot, I mean, it makes a point because, you know, white supremacists, their voices are so much louder than everybody else. So, like, to say that, you know, they want the statues to stay, and then, you know, there are people who aren't racist that want them to stay, and then they kind of just get grouped, like, oh, I guess they're white supremacists, they want the statue to stay. Everyone then kind of gets stuck in a category, and so, like, then you're losing, like, you know, you lose the dialogue, like, if you just remove them, you lose that history, and then so some people that don't want to remove the statues, like, there's a different context. Like, the Civil War, I think people forget that it wasn't, from the beginning, the Civil War, like, really wasn't about slavery. It was about the South wanting their right to secede from the Union. And so I think people forget about that aspect of it. Yeah, slavery did come into it at some point with the Emancipation Proclamation from Lincoln, but it did start out, like, as Lincoln being elected president, the South was like, no way, we want out. And that's what it was about. Not to disregard slavery and its importance, but there's also that aspect of it, and I just feel like we can't forget that.
Right. Shannon, you're going to
Okay.
I have a question. I think a lot of you are circling around
Right.
what this question is, which is like, how and why is a monument so resistant to historicization? Which I think is like what, when you offer up like moving the monument to a museum, it allows us to like break it as something that exists in the world as if nothing has, as if no history has happened, and allows us to look at it as a historical artifact, right, divorced from a contemporary moment. And so like, what about the monument in public space is so resistant to that, to being seen as an artifact of a certain period, rather than something that is continuing with us today?
That's a very good point, actually, yes. Interestingly, very quickly, the Blue Commission report here, I was surprised to find that they don't make historical distinctions. They see basically from Virginia, 1600 to today, one long stretch of Confederate sort of supremacy, or like white supremacy. So maybe both sides are resisting to historicize.
We shouldn't be celebrating heritage that involved such an evil. And as far as the museum, that's, you want something that will be there for everybody to remember that evil and those involved.
Yeah.
So this whole issue of heritage to me and people celebrating it, it would be like if Germany allowed Nazis to celebrate Nazism today.
So why are all of these monuments and memorials, including ones like this that are intended to provide some balance, one supposes, why are they, right, yeah, why are they all so beautiful? I mean, if I were trying to balance a monument to somebody who was a luminary in the Confederacy, I might balance that with a monument showing the horrors of the Civil War. Something that really highlights it. I mean, I think of, I hate to say this, I think of Auschwitz.
Right.
One of the reasons why Auschwitz is such a powerful memorial, I guess is the right word rather than monument, is because of what it was constructed for and what it represents and what it still looks like. And I don't think most people would consider that to be a glorification of the purpose for which it was constructed. And yet it is a very, very powerful negative reminder of the horror of that experience. This, to me, does absolutely nothing to offset the horror of the Civil War. Right. They're on very different levels. I mean, Arthur Ashe was a wonderful representative, but it is in no way counterbalancing the Civil War.
Sure. I think that's a great comment. A lot of people don't know that in the Civil War, you know, black people, African Americans, were on the front line. So they kind of pushed black people out first as, you know, the front line of defense in the Civil War. And so I think your comment is correct in noting that the horrors of the entire event kind of continued on. I think when I think of like the 4 options, I think they're kind of limiting. They're not creative enough, my opinion.
Yes.
What's wrong with doing 2 things, like transforming the places and building a museum? Like, what's the issue with that? I mean,
Well, I guess there's one bronze statue, so it needs to be either there or here.
but can't you just keep the like historical one and then, you know,
And make it
another one, but like that encompasses everything? Like, I don't know. I just feel like that's kind of a better compromise. You do both.
That sounds like a great architecture studio project. Do it. Create the miracle. Angela and Nelson.
You know, we're talking here too, these monuments of a material object. But to remember the past, there are other mediums that have been brought out, modern mediums, such as the movies. The movies certainly made of the Tuskegee Airmen, their contribution to World War II pilots. Also, in the past, a movie had been made very authentically of black men who were soldiers fighting during the Civil War. Those have the same object, same purpose, same motive. Remember the past. Remember what happened through a different medium. Are we going to now go in and destroy all those movies? See?
It's good to hear an easy question.
Huh?
No.
I didn't actually picture this kind of like balance when you talked about balancing in public space. So when you floated option 3, I was thinking of something else, and then I realized this is the concrete example. So this is sort of what somebody actually tried.
Right.
It's a particularly, I think, kind of unattractive and uninteresting sculpture. I mean, I also have a history as a public art administrator, so I know better than most like what the likelihood of getting something really great out of some sort of a public process around a commission is, and so I'm leery of it. But I guess what I was imagining when you floated option 3, which would be, or wait, was 2 sort of altering or marking? I think between 2 and 3.
2 is removed.
Okay, I was thinking more about commentary. So for example, when Larry brought up the Columbus Circle sculpture, there was a wonderful commission by the Public Art Fund about 5 years ago. Tazunishi designed a piece called Discovering Columbus that was an architectural intervention that sheathed it's very tall, I don't know how high up he is, but I mean, it's like you had to go up many floors of scaffolding, and then you entered a living room, and you were in the living room and there was a couch and a TV, but you were also at Columbus's level and you were spending time close to him in an American home. So you were having to reckon with him moving in with you, but you were also having to like climb a lot to go visit him and to think about why he, you know, so I mean, this would be very hard to administer, but I'd like to hold out hope that somewhere between 2 and 5, some option exists for really good interventions for commentaries.
So instead of just bringing the statue down from the pedestal, you go up to it.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking aloud now. I thought it was very funny, but I think what happened is you had to sit with everything. You had to sit. It looked like a suburban living room, so you had to sit in a suburban contemporary living room that you might have otherwise enjoyed, but you were sitting with this real-sized person who did the things he did. You could, you know, you couldn't shove him in the closet, right? He was like in the corner of the room.
So we want to thank you all for giving your comments out. I think this will be like a kind of like a work in progress. It's a very detailed manuscript that the city of Charlottesville has, and I want to encourage everyone to actually read it. And thank you.